like to call upon our next speaker, the post-break speaker, Yossi Matias. Please come up because you have slides, so the others will sit down. Yossi is Vice President of Engineering in Google Search. He's also the founding Managing Director of Google's R&D Center in Israel, with overall responsibility for Google research, development, and technology innovation in Israel. Under his leadership, the Israeli Center has developed core technologies in the areas of search, data analytics, Gmail, YouTube, IoT platforms, internet scale, infrastructure, and cloud, as well as pioneered an admirable initiative of bringing online hundreds of heritage collections, including the Yad Vashem photo archives and the digital Dead Sea Scrolls, seeding Google's Cultural Institute. Yossi is also the executive lead for Google's university research program across Europe, Middle East, and Africa, and was responsible for technology innovation in YouTube and data analytics. Finally, he's leading efforts in machine intelligence, member of a steering group for IoT, and is leading a global initiative for crisis response. I wonder what that is. The title of his lecture, Some Thoughts About Technology, Privacy, and Ethics.
As former rector of Tel Aviv University, I'm proud to add that Yossi is a professor at Tel Aviv University.
Yossi is also a professor in Tel Aviv University, for the record. Now, the floor is yours, Yossi. Coming from the heart of IT, we are really looking forward to your lecture.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the introduction and also for inviting me to this wonderful event, which talking about important topics which are close to my heart. So I thought I'll give some reflections about some of these topics, which are all topics I care about. And I'll start with going back actually 20 years, because that's where I started. I encountered for the first time this notion of privacy. And many of you may remember this now famous cartoon from The New Yorker, which was actually, I just read about it. It was done by the person who actually wrote it. It was back in 1993. There wasn't a lot of meaning behind it when he was drawing this cartoon, but very quickly it captured a lot of attention. And I remember that because 1993 was, of course, when the web kind of started. This was more or less when the first browser came about. And I was starting to think about these topics about 3 years later when this was 1996. In fact, the trigger for that was hearing a talk in a database conference. I was doing a lot of research on algorithms and databases. And I heard a talk about internet technologies and a comment that privacy on the internet is still one of the most difficult issues out there. And I started thinking about it. And when you think about the internet as a platform, it's actually a game changer. It changes things for various reasons. So obviously, this talks about, you can think about it from an anonymity point of view. You know, it can be anonymous. You can do whatever you want to. Or so you can actually take another persona if you'd like to. And and even back then, there were many discussions about what the implication of privacy is. In fact, there were dozens of proposals of laws in the US related to privacy, coming from all sorts of directions, many of them from not really understanding what technology should be doing and what not, and what should be regulated. But, and there was actually an even interesting proposal that was sponsored by two of the leading companies at the time, Microsoft and Netscape, called Passport, which was driven, actually spearheaded by a startup company that thought that perhaps every user should define their privacy preference. And this should somehow be taken into consideration in how their stuff. Now, my thinking about privacy at the time was that first, anonymity is not, that's not the question. Anonymity is relatively easy. But that's not what we want. We really want real interaction of people. The internet is kind of a new platform where people start interacting with each other. So I actually set up a small team and came up with this technology that got pretty good visibility. This is a New York Times article for '97. So in fact, we announced the technology demonstration a few months later during the FTC hearings on privacy. And the basic idea was that technology, this is a paper that we wrote on that. I was working as a researcher in Bell Labs at the time, which was part of Lucent. It was called the Lucent Personalized Web Assistant. And the basic idea was, well, the question is not really how do I remain anonymous on the internet. The really question is how do I control my interaction, my privacy with respect to whoever I talk to. So the way I was thinking about it is that really people don't have privacy preference. They have a preference with respect to whoever they interact with and with respect to the timing and the nature of the interaction. So obviously we have different kind of preferences when we get into a restaurant and we are happy that they are recognized us versus we get to a public space and perhaps we'd like to remain private. It may be different sense of privacy if we go to our doctor and to our banker. Obviously, we share a lot of information with each, but we wouldn't want that information to cross. And the basic idea there was actually quite simple. It was, well, I suppose I have this kind of proxy that manages my personas, and you can actually, this is kind of, for some it may be nostalgia, for some it may be a different topic for a talk about what happened to my Yahoo and my Excite and others. But essentially, these were websites where if you registered to them, you could get personalized services, which were better than if you just come there anonymous. And the idea is that personalized services is typically a good thing. You'd like to have it. It's helpful. People like it, actually. They opt into that. People don't necessarily opt in to be anonymous all the time and not to share information. They actually like in some places that people know their favorite coffee. They like it when when they're recognized in certain places, but they'd like to remain actually private in other places. So it's really about people controlling their privacy preference and their identity with respect to whoever they talk to. In that case, it was a very simple implementation. We put it out as a technology demonstration. It got very popular very quickly. Numbers today look kind of small, but million proxy clicks a day back in '97 was not bad at all. And it was only kind of, it was not a big product, just kind of a research project. And the basic idea was that there's this proxy out there that essentially, I'm just kind of coming in with my universal password and universal ID, and then for every destination that I interact with, it actually creates my different kind of credentials. And I have full control over those, so I can actually decide that from now on I actually don't want, for some reason, my Excite to know about my credentials because my Excite no longer kind of belongs to somebody else that I no longer trust. So it was a very simple approach and very powerful because the user had, the person had full control over the credentials, over what's going on. And the notion of user control is, to me, the most important notion when we talk about user privacy and people's privacy here. So this was kind of back 20 years ago. Now, when I got pretty involved in many privacy-related stuff and was actually a signature in this P3P that was mentioned earlier, and on some documents submitted by the CTF, etc. And thinking about privacy at the time was, well, if we do fast forward, the world is going to be very interesting because people are going to share information now that 20 years from now they're going to run for Congress and perhaps they don't think about what's going to happen then. And I was right and I was wrong because obviously that's the fact. I mean, everybody is now, you can look back and find a lot of silly information about people. But I was also wrong because what happens is that the notion of privacy and what people's expectation around it has changed dramatically over the years. Now, if you'd asked me 20 years ago that people would share as much personal information about themselves as they do, I would not think they would. And I'm not talking about kids, I'm talking about esteemed colleagues, people that are kind of respectful. So I guess 20 years ago, when somebody was going for a very respectful post, they were never teenagers. At least this was the perception. And today, the perception is different, and people share a lot, but some people actually want to share less. So some things have changed, many have not. So when I think about what happened in 20 years, technology, of course, did huge progress since then, and now the data that we have is used and serving us in so many aspects of life. In many applications on our phone, actually, in order for them to work properly, they need a lot of our own data, and we need to give it, to share that. So this notion of exchange and who do I trust and who not, etc., is now even amplified tenfold. Now, obviously, as a company that is a lot about giving information and services, Google is using a lot to improve our products using aggregate data. And by the way, most of these services are not so much targeting to the personal data. They are more based on the aggregate data out there. So if I look into information about maps or search or even autocompletion in search, this is a project actually done by my team, these are based on statistical information which is in the aggregate makes the magic that if you type W in your search box, then with high likelihood we know that you're probably looking for weather in Jerusalem because you're here. That's statistic information. The only personal information which is used here is the fact that you're in Jerusalem, and this is also a person's choice whether or not to share it. Otherwise, it will just search for weather. So similarly, completion in Chrome and many other stuff. So many of these services are based on data which is analyzed and aggregated. And most of it, by the way, or perhaps all of it, all of these examples are not really targeting people's data, even though there are services that are more targeting. For example, if I'm getting notification, hey, it's time to leave to Jerusalem in order to be in time for the conference, that's actually something that should rely on having access, of course, to perhaps my calendar and my map, etc. And again, that's something that people need to make a choice. So when we're thinking about it, so obviously, since we are using a lot of the data, there's a lot of serious consideration about, so what does it mean? How do we handle these very serious matters of people's privacy? And the principles that actually we have at Google are in spirit quite similar to the principles I mentioned earlier. It's all about people's control and choices over what they're doing. And this actually manifests itself to these four kind of areas that are about choice, about transparency, what is exactly collected, how is it, what can I do about it, control, making the change in a practically feasible way, and the aspect of security, and I'll mention that very briefly. I know that the next talk is about privacy and security, so probably there's going to be some discussions about these trade-offs, but in many cases, collecting the right information is crucial in order to be helpful in a security aspect. So for example, being able to identify a risk that somebody is hijacking an account rely on having some information about the account. So the question of the trade-offs here are there. And here's an example. I actually kind of took a screenshot of so-called my account, which essentially is a way for me to take a look into what is collected, what are my preferences, does it collect my local information, how can I change it? And there are quite a few people whose day job is actually to see how to advance that, not only on the technology side, but also to make sure that people are can have the access to that. So for example, I'm quite often getting notifications about, please go to my account and check out your privacy stuff. So it's our interest, actually, that people will exercise their choice, transparency, and control. And one should also realize that, because some of the comments sometimes I'm hearing is, oh, you know, it's the interest of these companies to actually somehow use that data without people knowing. That's actually not the case, because the number one asset that many of the internet companies have is really users' trust, people's trust. And therefore, sometimes when you see in the news some of the tension on the security side, you see that the line taken by some of the big tech companies is pretty strong in protecting people's privacy, even when there's some debate about protecting people's life using the information. So anyway, this is kind of our approach for that matter. And obviously, there's an ongoing question about how to deal with these services, because in order for me to get better services as a user, as a person, the more that the technology is aware of what I need, then the better I can get it. And that's, of course, a place where giving and sharing my information is motivating me to do that. Now, one observation that I remember, even when thinking about this 20 years ago, is that in many cases when people are facing with these questions, many people are talking about privacy and all that stuff, but at the end of the day, it's a question of trust, and also a question of practical convenience to what they'd like to do and value that they're getting. So nobody likes the idea that somebody is learning about what they're doing if they're not getting any value from it. But again, if I take the analogy, if somebody in a restaurant, somebody remembers their preference and they give them a better service, then many of them are actually maybe opting in for that, or at least not opt out if the option is there. So anyway, that's kind of an approach, at least taken by Google, but thinking about technology implication, and many are talking about the big players, but we should understand that technology actually creates new realities that are, some of which are not necessarily, we're aware of them all the time. Now, think about all the applications that we download and we use in our phone. Some of them are actually from less trusted entities. Actually, that's how, in many cases, malwares are kind of, bad things happen just because we like something we see, we don't pay too much attention. So the notion of trust is really crucial here, and there's a lot of work that needs to be done in order to see how, as an ecosystem, we can protect people better using technology. Now, this becomes even more intensified as we're talking about introducing new technology. So let me give one example that I encountered. When there's new technology, there are new questions. So one of the areas that is kind of emerging, and the pace in which it's emerging is still debatable, but it's clearly doing a lot of progress, is the notion of Internet of Things, or it has various names. In Internet of Everything, or just think about devices that are now connected to the internet and provide some services. So for example, what you see in the picture is a small, tiny device, and they can be even smaller, that they can be connected to the internet, and they can actually interact in the very simple fashion with their surrounding using something which is called Bluetooth Low Energy, which essentially is a version of Bluetooth that many of us heard about from earphones, etc., except that it's using a little less energy. And it's becoming more and more useful, so I was actually experimenting with this to see to what extent can we finally answer the question, can I ask Google, where are my keys? We actually had a nice prototype for that. Or if I could get notification when my suitcase arrives on the carousel so that I can actually read something instead of watching suitcases for 20 minutes. And I also had a pretty nice prototype for that, I must say. Now, as I was working on this project with my team, I discovered, much to my dismay, that this standard is actually pretty flawed. So it turns out that each of these devices has an ID that it transmits constantly, which essentially means that sometimes they call these, it's like digital programmable lighthouse. That if you walk with these devices, everybody becomes a small lighthouse where every application that can read Bluetooth can actually track everybody in their whereabouts. And we're not only talking about big entities that you can debate how much you trust them. Everybody could actually track them. So this is actually concerning, and this is an example for new technology that introduces these kind of new risks. In this particular case, we actually set up a small team. And by the way, it's not only about privacy, it's also spoofing, which is kind of disguising to be the one, all sorts of other unauthorized accesses. And we set up a small kind of project to put a layer that we call the Ephemeral ID, which essentially is a very simple cryptographic way to change the ID so that only those that are authorized, and I'm not going to go over this diagram, obviously, but essentially only the one that is authorized to know whose suitcase this is, which typically would be the owner plus perhaps family, would actually know that this is the ID of the suitcase. Otherwise, it would just look like a random string. And this was a not too difficult solution. We actually put it out, the code, in a repository of open libraries called GitHub, and put a server out there, and even put the spec. Anybody who wants can actually have their own server. And this was last year. And now everybody is secure, of course, and even some of the media thought that this is a solution for all the real-world web which is, of course, overly optimistic. This is one step in many that we need in order to address many security and privacy-related technologies in order to secure the world, because there are all these issues that we need to take into consideration. So these are a few of these tensions that we need to think about when we're thinking about privacy and technology, but also the tension between privacy and security. And again, some of them are really a social agreement stuff. I remember reading about a person whose family reported him lost in South America, and the phone company refused to disclose the lost location of that person because it was against the privacy agreement that they had with the person. And for the family, their claim was, hey, we may be able to save him if we know what is the last reading. And these are situations that we see quite often, and typically the resolution for that is to go to the court to get the agreement, etc. And the policy for most companies is actually to be very, to obey, to actually follow the privacy guidelines very strictly, because users' trust is important for companies, especially in the internet space where, you know, the statement typically is the competition is one click away, which is quite often the case. So there are all these tensions that I'm not going to talk about. I'd like actually to talk about other technologies that is generating some other set of very important questions, which are, many of which need to be resolved, not necessarily, some of which by technology, and some of it may be discussed and thought about as on other disciplines as a society. And this is in the context of artificial intelligence, which is one of the most fastest emerging kind of technology field, obviously, which is a game changer on so many aspects of our life. So the two terms typically here would be used, artificial intelligence and machine learning, which is another kind of, that's the technology that enables a lot of the new domains. And again, it's more than making progress, it's making substantial progress. So let me, again, give kind of a little reflection. These concepts are not new, of course, and they were discussed starting from many years ago. So this is a famous work by Samuel about a machine learning program that plays checker that actually got some, I think it was won first place in Connecticut, and it was pretty impressive for the time in the 50s. Now, I learned about it when I was doing my undergrad studies because I was interested in machine learning. I looked for the state of the art. I was disappointed to learn that this was the state of the art at the time. In fact, I wrote a program called Othello, or Reversi, that learned itself using some principles from Samuel, which just in a few days and nights of work managed to win all games except versus anybody who played. And at that time, I also discovered the importance of computational power for these games because I managed to crash the university system. Tel Aviv University, I was banned from using it for a week because of that. So I learned about the importance of computational power for this kind of technology. But it was actually quite impressive to me that with a few days, I could actually write a program that would learn to play this kind of game. But of course, it was a simple game. And of course, the question of AI and machine learning, et cetera, goes back to Alan Turing. He was the one who was asking about, are machines going to be intelligent enough to fool other people, that they are talking with machines rather than people, the so-called imitation game, if you've seen the movie. And these are fascinating questions, of course. And for many years there was debates, and there was the so-called winter of AI, where there was a lot of promise and a lot of disappointment because it didn't live to the promise. There was this big milestone just a few weeks ago. There was 20 years to Kasparov losing to Deep Blue, which was shaking the world about, wow, machine can actually play better than the best chess player, even though it was already playing better than probably everybody I know. And at about the same time, there was this notion of big data coming out, data warehouses, how to analyze a lot of data to learn about the world and do stuff more effectively. So I was fortunate to be part of the work that was done on that. And of course, it created this big hype about big data. Everybody did big data. Now, with machine learning, actually, one of the, if talking about games, a pretty remarkable milestone was by my colleagues from London, actually, the DeepMind folks, who are now, was bought by Google a few years ago, which they actually developed this computer game called AlphaGo that was playing against Lee Sedol, who was one of the world best players in Korea. And by the way, this game apparently had more views than the Super Bowl. And it's a hugely popular game in Korea and China. And much to everybody's shock, actually, AlphaGo won most of the games. Not only that, but it actually innovated. It kind of had some moves that all expert players thought are inconceivable for a Go. That's not what they learned in textbooks for many, many years. So somehow there was really intelligence there. So this was kind of a little shaking to the community, and this was based now on a different approach than the one that the chess program that won over Kasparov, because it was using now a new technology which is called deep learning. I'll talk about it in a moment. Another milestone a year later was another AlphaGo game that won against some 60 or so experts, and then also the world champion. This was in China, and this was a very convincing win. But quite surprisingly, just a few weeks ago, there was a paper in Nature that with a new program called Alphago Zero. And Alphago Zero, unlike the previous games that learned from people's games, actually learned to play on its own. It's a program that is based on machine learning technology that was actually training itself versus itself. And what you see here is really that in about 3 days, it actually got to the level of AlphaGo that won Lee Sedol. In 21 days, it actually got to the level that won against the Chinese champion. And in 40 days, it got to the level that it actually won 100 versus 0 against AlphaGo of 2 years earlier. And this was actually learning on its own. So the notion of artificial intelligence systems that learn on its own is really a remarkable phenomenon from a technological point of view, and obviously it has many implications. Now, the basic progress here is something called deep neural network. Again, neural networks are not something new. It was something that back in the 60s, and it became quite popular, I think, in the 70s, and then again, it was kind of the so-called winter of AI. But about a few years ago, there was kind of a breakthrough, which was shown that on some benchmarks on images actually did better than everybody anticipated. And with a combination of refined algorithms, but a lot of data and computational power, this became actually a technology that now is hugely, hugely successful in many domains. Here's an example of how we use it at Google. This is just a chart showing how many files we have in our code which are using deep learning technology in our various products. And these are all products that are all using machine learning and deep learning in some shape or form to improve whatever we do in places that are kind of artificial. Here are a few examples on improving Gmail spam, speech recognition, which is pretty phenomenal if you try it these days. Photo search, which is, again, a game changer given that everybody can search in their photos of sunset in the beach, and it will just find it without any labeling, or find me a bird or something else. Technology that in real time can enable you to actually look into sign and see that in different, in your language. And actually we just announced kind of earphones that you can listen to somebody talking to you in one language and listen to you in real time with your own language. These are all enabled by this kind of hugely successful and Translate, which is now competitive with People's Expert. So these are all amazing kind of advancements in artificial intelligence, and also many optimization questions. So even, it's funny, but one of the first professions to be impacted by this new technology is really those of software engineers. They need to learn how to use machine learning because in some cases it's doing a better job than algorithms. So it's interesting to watch it. Now, another area, totally in different domain, that I think is, to me, one of the most exciting areas is the area of health. This is an example from a research done on a problem called diabetic retinopathy, which apparently is many people in diabetes are at risk of getting this disease that could cause blindness. Now, in India alone, there are 127,000 shortage of doctors to actually do this kind of examination. And 45% of people, I believe, that are eventually examined, they get it too late to actually get the right treatment. So it's a big, big problem. Now, the good news is that research on machine learning found performance which is competitive to medical experts in analysis of these images. So this can now be complementary to experts and actually address this kind of stuff. And this to me is kind of an example for what we can do. So quite often people are talking about risks in AI and machine learning, but to me the biggest risk, we need to be conscious about various important considerations around it. But to me the biggest risk is not adopting it quickly enough to save many more lives on medical and other areas, and transportation and other stuff. Now, a quick note on machine learning. So one of the big technology, obviously technology threads that we've seen in the last decade is the notion of cloud technology, the effect that we can take many of the technologies, make them available for anybody to use. And people are already using it for basic server applications. They're using it for, to connect to various libraries that can do a lot of jobs. And now they can do that actually with machine learning stuff. And this is extremely powerful because once you do that, it's kind of a democratization of AI. In a way, every person around the globe can actually take the libraries and use it for their own needs. So this is an example on the left-hand side, a guy who took his family business of cucumbers and used machine learning using the cloud technology to actually accelerate it and give more business to them. In fact, I was just meeting with students in Ghana, in Ashesi, that's the university there, and we discussed a lot about technologies and what can be done, etc. And one of my prime messages to them was that each and every one of them can actually tackle any big problem that they encounter and leverage on the cloud technology and on machine learning libraries, which are out there, essentially the same libraries that we're using for voice recognition and translate. They could take it and use it for whatever problem that they want to, which is extremely powerful, and I think this is, I'm really seeing a lot of optimism on that side. Health, environment, and more. I actually have a small research team looking into can we use machine learning in order to have a better flood prediction. Floods is the #1 killer. There are thousands of people dying every year because of floods worldwide. If we would have a little better prediction, that would actually save lives. So the question, crisis response is really about using technology to help with crisis. And I have a team actually working on many aspects of that. Now, these are all on the bright side, but in the context of this workshop, I thought that perhaps I should talk about also some of the very serious questions that these developments are bringing up. And I would call them under responsible development. So obviously we are on the verge of using machine learning and AI to real-life problems in a pretty profound way. And also there are many research challenges remain. For example, one thing that people are concerned about sometimes is that in many cases these models that are generated, we don't really understand what's going on there. And some would say this is not a problem. That's fine. We also don't understand really what happens in some other technologies we are using. And for others, it's, well, no, we'd like to actually understand what's going on. Now, this may be related to some of the real challenges that we need to pay attention to. For example, how do we ensure that the systems that are using AI and machine learning are fair? One observation is that when you train your machine learning models based on world input, in many cases, you actually learn from the bias which is already there. And that's a problem. We actually encounter that sometimes. We encounter that when we see image searches that are very much biased just because it's using whatever data that is there. We see that in language understanding. So most models that are going to be trained on texts, when there's going to see a doctor, they're going to say he, because that's statistically what they're going to do. So there's going to be a reinforcement of biases which are based on statistics or biases which are based on perceptions. And these biases are actually something that we need to be conscious about and be careful about. Now, some of these systems actually are also, it's creating other questions. One of the interesting conversations around autonomous cars is those questions, what should an autonomous car do if it's facing the dilemma between taking an action that would save their passenger or save somebody crossing the street. And sometimes suppose the situation is that it needs to take an action that is going to put at risk one of them. What's the choice? Now, one observation is that many of these choices that are now kind of surfacing, these are not ethical dilemmas that are new. These are dilemmas that today perhaps we're not tackling them heads down because the question about autonomous car is the same for a driver. what do you do? What should a driver do? But with people, we say, well, they should actually take a choice. So we kind of push it aside. Once we're talking about systems who learn, we need to be conscious about these questions. We need to be more proactive, thinking about what are the implications for that. Now, of course, there are also questions, so should we always use these, or should we refrain from using some of these systems in some cases? And obviously, technology is a tool. So we'd like to use it for the benefit of humanity and for people, but obviously we want to prevent it from being abused by others. So these are some interesting and important questions. And of course, there are the more social questions. So if technology is going to replace drivers or others, what should we do about it? What can we do about it? Should we, and again, these are not entirely new questions. Interestingly enough, of course, the Luddites in the UK dealt with these questions. And as an anecdote, one of an active Luddite was Lord Byron, who happened to be the father of the woman who's considered the first programmer, Ada Lovelace. So these are interesting connections about how an active Luddite and the first programmer ever. And of course, there's some questions about creative work. There are some now computer programs that are writing music, which sounds good. There are actually, I just read an article about somebody just issuing an album that was totally created by software. And there are these computer programs that actually do paintings that actually look amazingly professional, which puts a question about creativity. Is it replacing the creativity, or is it enhancing creativity? These are active debates. Actually, I have had quite a few conversations with my son, who's a professional musician. And one angle for this debate is that it kind of raises the bar of what we consider creativity, because many of these systems actually now do the stuff that is craftsmanship. But again, as I mentioned, we see also creative inventions by some of these programs. And if you think about it, if you let a sophisticated program to run for thousands of experiments, it's also going to discover some novel stuff. So it's going to create some interesting questions for us, I guess, as scientists as well. So anyway, just to point out for a few directions to tackle some of these questions. So first is this so-called partnership on AI, which many companies, as you can see by the logos, are involved with, who are looking into some of these questions, some of these discussions. What should we consider? How should we tackle that, etc.? I'm a great fan of solving problems with technology whenever applicable, and it's typically more applicable than you'd think about. So here's an example for something that was just in the context of models of data. One thing I did not touch about, but when we build a model of machine learning, we're actually building it based on some statistical information based on activity of actual people. And there are situations that we may be concerned about. Are we building a model that may actually reveal the identity of somebody who contributed to the model? So some of it is really understanding when can we have the right aggregation that is considered private, but sometimes it's really taking other measures. This is an example called federated learning. So the basic idea is that in many cases we're using our phone for stuff that we'd like that to learn how we are actually, the mistakes we're doing on a keyboard, or our personal voice when you talk to it. So there's a lot of personal stuff that if it would build machine learning models that are more adapted to our private behavior, it's going to do a better job. So one approach, for example, is to make sure that these models are learned on the device itself only, and the only information shared for the better learning of the aggregate model is really a very reduced version of that. So this notion of using cryptographic techniques to actually make this kind of communication effectively, using various techniques such as differential privacy and otherwise. So this is an example for a technique that a way to use technology to address some of these concerns and do it in a way that addresses both, improves the utility as well as addresses the possible concerns about what are we doing with the data. And there are other kind of initiatives about people and AI. How can we make sure that people are more aware of what's going on? How can we use AI to empower people? How can we think about the right interaction, etc.? And again, there's much more opportunity for more work to be done here. So in summary, I think that the new reality of this exciting world of machine learning and AI is that it can have positive impact on all aspects of life. I think it's a perfect storm also where scientific research and technology really are at their peak. So it's pretty amazing that in the leading scientific conferences on these topics, they are sold out months and months ahead. It's something that, you know, I don't know how many of us actually experienced sold out scientific conferences in the past. And the nice thing is that actually the questions, the technology questions and the research questions are both important. It's not, you don't have this large gap of technology transfer. Really, the new scientific advancements quite often is directly impactful on technology. I think about AI, one implication is that I think about it from artificial intelligence to ambient intelligence. We're using it more and more in a way that we're not thinking about it. And to me, this is a good thing. I think that we are kind of in a situation, I think Ruth mentioned all these disruptions we have in our daily life with technology. I think, or perhaps hope, that this is temporarily. I think that we are going to converge into a situation that many of these interactions are going to be more seamless, and we are going to actually take control over our life, over our attention, over our availability, our time, what we're doing and what not. So I think that hopefully technology is going to help us. And as I mentioned, all these are important to do along with what I would call responsible development. Thank you very much.
Yossi, thank you very much for a fascinating lecture. You gave us a peek into the future. And that reminds me of the ongoing debate, is technology good or is technology bad? And I liked very much the answer of Professor Kranzberg, who was a philosopher of technology at the University of Pennsylvania, who said, technology is not good, technology is not bad, but neither is neutral, because it depends how it interacts with people. Please.
Like you to relate to the tension between privacy and public information collected and disseminated through Google and the right to be forgotten, which was imposed on Google by the European Court of Justice. And my question is, how do we cope with it? And is there any floodgate of applications to erase information stored and being possible to be disseminated by Google?
So, yeah, I'm not working directly on that, so I don't know how much I can talk about the details on that. But this touches in principle on trade-off, which is obviously very important, the trade-off of access to information versus the right to be forgotten as was declared, which I think some of these questions are really more social questions, which is where do we put the line? What do we do with that? Some of it is really a practical question. How can we do that? Now, I think that what we observe in many cases that obviously, if we look at the mission of Google, which is to organize the world's information, make it universally accessible and useful, then we're very much see ourselves as the ones that want to make sure that any person, we have this narrative that the user come first. It's never about, by the way, the revenue or the dollars. It's always the user comes first. And by the way, as another side note, search at Google is totally separated organizationally and for all practical purpose from our ads kind of approach. So the only question we're asking ourselves always is what is the right answer to the user? And obviously, as a company, a company always obeys the law, whatever it is, to the extent, and there were a lot of discussion about what's practical to do there on this one. Now, I think that in this really is a reflection of attention that indeed we have about what do we want as a society to control about the information and who should actually do that. And I think that obviously there were many learnings around that, but again, unfortunately, I cannot get into more details.